Ladies and gentlemen, our warmest greetings and thank you for choosing our company. This is the United News Marathon. The We Are Ukraine channel team continues its work, and I will be with you in the studio for the next 3 hours. My name is Konstantin Linchevsky. Let's start with the latest operational updates. In general, we'll be talking a lot about security today. Specifically, let's look at the current status of Ukraine's airspace. And we have part of Sumy region is red, as are the entire Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia regions, part of Dnipropetrovsk, part of Kharkiv, and temporarily occupied Crimea. Friends, we're monitoring not only what's happening in our skies, which we'll report on, but also what's happening on the ground in particular. The army of the Russian Federation has been violating the declared ceasefire for the second day in a row. Over the past day, the occupiers carried out 144 assaults on the positions of the defense forces. They also used over 5,000 drones and shelled settlements and our troops' positions more than 1,500 times. The Pokrovsk direction remains the most intense. The Russians conducted 30 attacks there and another 14 in the Huliaipol direction. The occupiers are also pressing on the Lyman sector of the front, where the armed forces of Ukraine repelled 11 enemy assaults, specifically near Zarikne, Drobyshev, Lyman, Stavky, and Ozern. During the May 9th military parade in Moscow, Russia showcased its new Geran 5 jet-powered missile drone for the first time. The occupiers have already used it for strikes against Ukraine. According to Defense Express analysts, the design is an attempt to copy the Ukrainian Flamingo cruise missile or the Iranian Karar drone. However, the Russian Geran 5 is smaller than the Flamingo, has a much smaller warhead, 90 kilograms versus 1 ton, and a range 3 times shorter, up to 1,000 kilometers. We'll discuss this and more next. We have the opportunity to speak with Serhiy Brachuk, a military expert and spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. Mr. Serhiy, we are glad to welcome you.
Glory Ukraine, glory Defense Forces. Greetings.
Glory to the heroes. Mr. Serhiy will likely talk more about these light cruise missiles that our viewers just saw on the screen behind me. Mr. Serhiy, the ceasefire declared by the Russians as well. What is the situation as of now? What signals are we seeing? What signals is the world seeing, by the way?
Well, indeed, a ceasefire was declared under American guarantees. It's obvious that these guarantees, well, at least 100%, definitely didn't work. Russia, as always, uses the announced so-called ceasefire to carry out troop regrouping and to build up forces in its most priority directions. And obviously, they're trying to use these days to transfer reserves and conduct rotations from one direction to another. For example, we know that from the Sumy region, certain units of the Russian Airborne Forces, VDV, are being moved today specifically to the Zaporizhzhia front. I'll remind you that the Dnieper grouping operates there, commanded by the head of the Russian VDV, General Teplinsky. So it's clear that more paratroopers could be added to those already deployed there. This speaks to the so-called ceasefire and the fact that Russians still prioritize the Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk fronts. And actually, today there's active talk about the upcoming start of a summer campaign or a summer offensive phase. On one hand, it's obvious that their spring offensive phase has failed. Today, they don't even mention any achievements because, frankly, there are none. On the other hand, this so-called ceasefire allows Russians to traditionally regroup and push their troops along the entire front line. As you noted, the priorities are the Pokrovsk direction, the Huliaipol sector, and the Lyman sector. In the Donetsk region, they're trying to reach the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. By the way, the enemy unfortunately has some tactical advances here. Of course, it's not that our troops just retreated to fulfill the so-called ceasefire. No, the enemy is simply trying to use these days for that very purpose. I think we'll see even more activity in these directions in the near future. That's why I said these troop transfers are evidence of exactly that.
By the way, Serhiy, while I was preparing for our broadcast and for our conversation today, I happened to notice several different publications, including some in Western media, that were attempting to analyze the current state of the front line. And I noticed a certain cultivation of emotional swings, with some people even saying, well, you know, summer is ahead. Russians traditionally tend to get more active once the foliage in the area provides cover and concealment, so it will definitely be tougher in terms of combat operations, I mean. And another camp argues that not every victory of ours is truly a victory. Some are actually setbacks, while the failures of the Russian Federation are in fact being transformed by many people into their own special hidden maneuvers. I'd like to take this opportunity while we're on the air to really hear your perspective on what's happening right now on the front line on a, if you will, broader strategic scale.
Well, if we're talking strategic scale, let's be honest, Russia has already begun using its strategic reserve in some places today, returning once again to the fact that Russia is suffering very heavy losses today. If we look at, let's say, the efficiency ratio, how much territory has been captured versus how many personnel the enemy is losing for every square kilometer of Ukrainian land, it's probably too early to summarize the results of this spring because May is still ongoing. But looking at the first week of May, for example, we see that the Russian advance is perhaps the smallest since 2023. And look at the price Russia is paying for every square kilometer today. If we look back at March, this is very rough. These aren't absolute figures, but I'd like to show the trend. In March, for example, they were losing 120, 130, 140, 150 people for every square kilometer of Ukrainian land. Then in April, that number increased. It surpassed 200. Those are irreversible losses. And actually, the first week of May showed that before the so-called truce, Ukrainians are dealing such blows that the enemy is forced to expend a lot of manpower, suffering losses that have already exceeded 300. If this trend continues, which I'd very much like to see after the so-called truce, then it's clear confirmation of the idea that the Russians are using their strategic mobilization reserve. That will be the proof, although we understand perfectly well that the information component, of course, accompanies any combat operations. But today it's obvious that Russia, with the resources it has, I won't say they've run out or will run out tomorrow, but it's facing certain problems accordingly. Although the tasks facing the Russian command, the military, political tasks, remain unchanged. The Donetsk region, the attempt to create a broad front for an offensive on Zaporizhzhia, that's what's in the enemy's plans. And of course, we're talking about how summer, with its foliage and more, are factors that could prompt the Russians to take more active measures. And actually, Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi says that the Russians have stepped up their activity across the entire front line. Infiltration, trying to advance between our battle formations, that's the tactic the enemy has used and will continue to use. This is despite the fact that they have equipment, it's being accumulated, but for obvious reasons, the Russians aren't risking its use in meat grinder assaults.
Friends, if I may, I'd also like to comment on what Mr. Syrskyi said. If you're interested, search for Syrskyi's asymmetric strategy. I think you'll find many answers there. Mr. Syrskyi, we must discuss the parade on Red Square, the one that's already taken place. The defense forces of Ukraine made every effort to ensure it didn't happen at all. But nevertheless, well, with regard to this Gerund 5, generally about what was shown there, or rather what was not shown there, what do you think?
Well, actually, this story reminded me of something, maybe a crude comparison, but the Russians' attempt to copy, for example, our naval strike drones like Magura or Sea Baby, respectively. There were such attempts. There were demonstrations, not at parades, but at relevant exhibitions. They are trying to scale up these processes. They have these drones. They're not as good as ours, but nevertheless, they copy and steal. Well, actually, I think the same thing happened with the Gerund 5. Today, it's clear that even an inflatable Armata tank couldn't replace the equipment that was missing from the Russian parade. They had to show something. Although I think that the world was actually more impressed, not so much by Moscow with its parade and the Gerund 5, but for example, by what is sometimes called the so-called parade of uniforms in Chita, where widows, or whatever the proper term is, marched in one of the parade formations. And then there were the so-called cripple regiments in some other Russian regions. As for the Gerund, this process is certainly being tracked today. The Russians are trying to scale it up, trying to bring that Gerund 5 because they've already used it to certain standards, because today it really looks like a copy. And I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to it. We really should, and actually work proactively, including on how to counter it. How successful we'll be remains to be seen, and as far as I know, our engineers are already working on it.
Mr. Serhi, in your opinion, this is open information regarding the components, including those of this Jaran 5. Do our Western partners take into account the information that Ukraine in particular provides them regarding all these Chinese engines and Western European or even American circuit boards?
Well, actually, President Macron will have a great opportunity to talk about the Jaran 5, for example, with Xi Jinping starting from May 13th. I think Ukraine could prepare relevant materials and transmit them through diplomatic channels. It's obvious that without China's support today, the Russians couldn't have the Jaran 5, 4, 3, or conversely 6 or 7, because it's obvious that Russian industry is simply not capable of this today. So we can see where one of the tools for ending the Russo-Ukrainian war is located. It is located in Beijing. Whether Trump and Xi Jinping will talk about this, I don't know. Well, that's not really the topic of our conversation today. But Ukraine has some pretty, shall we say, weighty arguments to show just how actively China is helping the Russian Federation today. And Russia therefore feels, well, let's say, if not confident, it's far from confidence, but a little bit more at ease about it. So there is plenty to talk about, indeed.
And we have 5 more minutes. Friends, I'd really like to recall certainly an interesting case. A Ukrainian heavy attack drone crew freed 2 infantrymen from Russian captivity. This happened in the northern Slobozhansky direction while they were being led to the occupiers' positions. Russian soldiers tried to escort our fighters to their positions, but hearing the drones hum, they abandoned the prisoners and fled. The drone crew caught up and eliminated both guards with precision strikes, and the freed Ukrainian soldiers successfully reached their units' positions. The 21st Separate Mechanized Brigade says this is the first such recorded case in this direction, specifically. Mr. Serhi, I'll explain to our viewers which heavy attack drone we're talking about. We're talking about the Baba Yaga, famous for us and infamous for the enemy. I'll remind our viewers that we're talking, friends, about originally an agricultural drone. Mr. Serhi, what's the secret in your opinion? It's the 5th year of the war and the Russians everything continues to shake, even when they see the Baba Yaga or a vampire.
Well, actually, we understand that those with extra chromosomes were raised on fairy tales about Baba Yaga, and naturally they react to it. Although it's actually a vampire, yes, that's what we officially call it. Can you imagine if this vampire or Baba Yaga doesn't just hum, doesn't just drop things, but also says, "Good evening, we are from Ukraine." Well, we understand, right? The emotional state of the Russians, and it turns out it even talks. Jokes aside, in any case, we see that no copying has happened here. First of all, from the Russian side, no matter how hard they tried, and actually it's the professional skill of our pilots after all. The crew, accordingly, did a simply superb job, and I think such cases will become more and more frequent, both with the use of the Vampire and with our other robotic systems, including not only in the air, but also on the ground. And we see that this innovative approach is what gives us the opportunity today, including to talk and communicate here in the studio, because on the front, accordingly, the front itself is holding. There are no breakthroughs of the line of combat contact because robotic systems are working. Today, the lives of our infantrymen are being saved accordingly, and they fight for every soldier. Because we see this situation, yes, they were taken prisoner. Our people truly don't leave their own behind, but various security situations happen as well. They were able to, I think this is an example of how it can be used. Well, as for the emotional state of the Russians, I know that you also monitor the relevant Russian social media pages. They really write about Baba Yaga, not just with awe, but with a certain fear, even if it's not buzzing over them. A good development indeed. This drone was supposed to be used for other purposes, but I hope that the Russians will continue to feel such a hum over them, not only from Baba Yaga, but from other drones. Well, and actually, we understand that, well, a roasting from our side is already waiting for the Russians somewhere, because the so-called truce is ending, and there is something to punish the Russians for. I would very much like to talk about this next time.